on the gold front, we're seeing that now with Russia backing its currency with gold. There's this interest in like, well, what, maybe we should have gold. Maybe everybody should have it at, close to home. Uranium is exactly the same thing, and perhaps even more of a dire situation in the U.S. The U.S. uses about 50 million pounds of uranium a year. The U.S. is the biggest generator of nuclear power in the world, and yet has almost zero domestic supply of uranium. I mean, that's an incredible. There's no other metal where the shortfall is that big. Some other metals like nickel, EV metals like that, America's fairly short. But I mean, America does have a few major mines of those other things. When it comes to uranium, we just don't have any big mines at all, which in a country that needs a lot of uranium. So, I mean, I think that's the real challenge and the real opportunity in the space right now is to try to.
Hey everybody, this is Rob Keens from GoldSilverPros.com. I am joined by a first-time guest on the program to talk uranium. It is David Forrest, who's the CEO of IVOR Exploration. And this is a company I went on a mine tour here recently with David and a bunch of other people to see what they've got out there in Nevada. It was a lot of fun, and we'll get into the details of that. But first, David, how are you doing today?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me, Rob. This is awesome.
Yeah, glad to have you on. It was a lot of fun going out to the mine tour, and some of the things we were talking about really, David, is a reemergence of uranium. And we've been talking about that on Gold Silver Pros. Even though we're a precious metals focused channel, we've been talking about it probably 5 to 6 months. And we've had a lot of guests come on to talk about uranium. It just seems like right now there's renewed interest. The price is up. It looks like a lot of people are getting more interested. Why did you get involved in uranium? Why was uranium interesting to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, like it sort of relates back to gold and silver and really all metals in that there's this big push now for domestic supply of almost everything. And, it's in the US for sure, but in almost every country around the world now, everybody wants to have supplies of all these important metals close to home. And I mean, on the gold front, we're seeing that now with Russia backing its currency with gold. There's this interest in like, well, what, maybe we should have gold. Maybe everybody should have it at, close to home. Uranium is exactly the same thing, and perhaps even more of a dire situation in the U.S. The U.S. uses about 50 million pounds of uranium a year. The U.S. is the biggest generator of nuclear power in the world, and yet has almost zero domestic supply of uranium. I mean, that's an incredible. There's no other metal where the shortfall is that big. Some other metals like nickel, EV metals like that, America's fairly short. But I mean, America does have a few major mines of those other things. When it comes to uranium, we just don't have any big mines at all, which in a country that needs a lot of uranium. So, I mean, I think that's the real challenge and the real opportunity in the space right now is to try to like fill that gap and revamp the American, uranium sector for the coming, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years.
David, this is something I'm very interested in. I'll be speaking at a conference called Strategic Investment Insights in Chicago here the first week of May. And the panel I'll be on is talking not only macroeconomic factors in the economy, but it's also talking about resource independence versus dependence.
Right.
And in the changing world, what does that really mean? I think if we look at what's going on in the world, it's pretty safe to say countries are starting to protect their commodities. We got countries saying they're not going to release cooking oils. We got countries saying, well, if you, like Russia saying, if you want to buy our natural gas, you got to do it in rubles. So I don't know if we're back going into this era of protectionism that we last saw probably over a century ago, but it seems as though people are starting to figure out where are the resources we're going to have for our industry and our country. And I think that means that we need to do that in the United States, and uranium, of course, is a very big one. So,
yeah, I mean,
what is it? Why do you suppose we haven't developed our own uranium supplies over the last years?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it's been, so when you look back, the history is interesting. I mean, the U.S. was a significant producer of radioactive associated minerals, like things like rare earths. And then starting in the 80s, there was a big push from the IAEA to put in rules about the handling of all these things. And basically those rules constricted the domestic industry almost completely to the point where production in other places like China took off. And yet close to home, basically all of these projects died off. So we still produce a little bit of uranium around the US. Like there's a few projects and a few, somewhat significant projects, but there just haven't been any ones of scale that can produce, we're talking projects that can produce 500,000, 1 million pounds a year when you need 50, so a lot of it has just been regulation and political will. And I'd say, like, if you go back to even the last uranium cycle, like 2005 to 7, we had a big run in uranium prices. There was somewhat of a resurgence in nuclear power or an interest in nuclear power in places like China. But what's different this time around is we have a real push to get nuclear power, in the US, to get behind, not only developing new nuclear power generation sources, but in, securing the uranium that you need to supply those things and keep them online. I think that's the big difference now. And that's the really encouraging thing about the environment from the point of view of developing, nuclear power or developing uranium projects. I don't think we've seen a political will like this in the US for, close to 75 years, probably going back to the 50s.
Yeah, let's talk about the recent bear market in uranium and some of the things that characterize that, especially politically and culturally. You had Fukushima, you had the green movement where people were saying uranium may not be the green energy and we want to go to wind and solar. Mm-hmm. I think that narrative has kind of fallen apart the last few years as wind and solar can't replace baseload capabilities.
Right.
It looks like, Japan is restarting. It looks like China wants 150 new nuclear reactors. Mm-hmm. We've seen what happened with Germany. They're turning down their nuclear, and now they're having issues with Nord Stream and the gas coming from Russia. Mm-hmm. And they're saying that they could have rolling brownouts this winter. So mm-hmm. It seems to me that the environment for about 10 or 12 years was very negative, but it's turning around. Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've hit a real inflection point in the attitude towards, because there is this growing recognition that air pollution and the associated problems of climate change, are probably one of the biggest things that are potentially hampering the development of human society right now. Mm-hmm. And when you look at how do you address that, really, nuclear is the only non-fossil fuel baseload power available that we know of. Maybe geothermal to some degree if you live in the right place to have it, but you're talking and to your point about Europe, what a situation in Europe now. Even before all these Russia problems happened, natural gas prices were 10 times what they are in the US. Mm-hmm. That's without all the Russian supply. And that was really just people banking on renewables, saying, we're going to go to wind and we're going to go to solar. And then you had countries like the Netherlands come out, just recently, last couple of years, and say that didn't work. That just didn't work. And then pivot to nuclear, because if you're talking non-fossil fuel sources, that's really the only way to go. There isn't much else. So I think, the attitude has changed. It's not a new attitude. It's interesting. I spoke probably 15 years ago, maybe even 20, with one of the founders of Greenpeace, co-founders of Greenpeace. And at the time he was saying, nuclear power is the future for the planet. This is the only solution, to sort of moving society forward. So that attitude's been there, but I think you're right. Now people are embracing that outlook. We're seeing people, actually like a wider range of people sort of coming around to that fact and saying like, look, this is the solution and we need to get going on this quickly.
Yeah, and I think we should look to change the culture, how people look at this, especially from the green movement, because I was one of the first to adopt, a lot of people don't know this, I was one of the first to adopt solar panels on my home. The very first home that we owned, we bought in 2004 in Texas, because we get such good sunlight down here for about 7-8 months a year. We put solar panels up on the roof, and it provided a lot of capacity for us. But due to the nature of solar, it doesn't do it all day long. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it produces too much, and most of the time it's not producing enough. So we still have to have our baseload capabilities. So even though we went solar on a big, little bit mansion that we had in North Texas and had kilowatts worth of power available to us, we still had to be connected to the grid, and actually did a grid agreement with our local utility to say, at times a day we're pushing electricity to you, at times a day you're pushing it to us, we'll net it out. Mm-hmm. but we always had to have that base load. It did reduce our bill. It was not a replacement. And I think in Texas, we saw with the wind farms, they froze when it got really cold. And so we had to depend upon natural gas and coal. And we even had shutdowns February a year ago, 2021, because we didn't have enough base load capacity due to wind and solar. So I can speak from experience. Wind and solar don't solve base load programs. I'm all for it where you can add it, but it has to be additional capacity. We need to figure out what our base load is going to be. And in Texas, for the longest time, it was natural gas and coal, and now they're getting rid of coal. So what else is there?
Right.
You got natural gas, but the shales are drying up a little bit. People don't know that. We're sitting on the Barnett in North Texas. It's, a lot of that's drying up.
Yep.
That has natural gas and has some oil.
Yeah.
So nuclear is the thing, right? So I think it's blatantly obvious nuclear is the thing. Now I wanted to get into your project because we went out and toured it. It was really cool. We went out to Nevada and just kind of walk us through. It's the old Apex mine. Walk us through a little bit about the history of that old mine, David, and why this could be so important.
Yeah. So what was really interesting when I started looking at this project, it's Nevada's largest past producing uranium mine. So in the 50s, and when you read the reports from the 50s, it was a big deal. They said this is one of the most important uranium mines in the continental United States. It was a big, this was during the boom in uranium production. So the government was funding uranium exploration and development across the country. So it actually produced about 50% of Nevada's total uranium output. And it did that in just a couple of years, actually. It was a very quick development and shipped ore to Salt Lake. So it was a major supplier. And it's kind of sat idle. Basically, there was some work done on it in the 60s and 70s, but it's largely sat idle since then and hasn't really been revisited in any kind of modern sense. So that's what we're doing with IVOR Exploration, is bringing the first modern, and there have been a lot of new techniques. When this was being developed at the tail end of its life was really when the uranium industry kicked into sort of maturity, with all the discoveries in Saskatchewan and all kinds of new exploration techniques. Garrett Akinsworth, who's our lead advisor, has discovered 2 uranium mines in Canada. And so a lot of the techniques that were used to discover those didn't exist back when this mine was in its heyday. So, we're really excited about the opportunity to bring all of that exploration, all those techniques to this deposit, to kind of this sleeping giant, and look at bringing it back into production.
Yeah. So, and the interesting thing is, this original deposit was something like 200 meters on its side square. So you're talking about a relatively small in terms of a mine operation. But when we went out there, we were talking about, hey, this has expansion potential because there's geology here that could lend itself to having a bigger deposit. And I know that you guys haven't finished doing all your drilling, but what do you think that could look like in the future? Do you think you're sitting on something that could potentially be much bigger than what they had in the past?
Yeah. So, the interesting leads on the sort of expansion potential, and you're right, the area that produced was a fairly compact area, the old miner. That said, there's 2,600 feet of underground workings on 4 levels. So it was pretty significant, but it's a pretty compact area. It's one of the interesting things when you compare uranium to other minerals that we mine for. It's super valuable. The ores, even at the grade, typically in the US, you'd have a grade of maybe 0.05, 0.1% uranium. Apex was 0.25, so it's higher grade than the average, or the past production was 0.25. When you start looking at that, the values per ton are higher on average than many other minerals that we mine for. Now, what was really striking about Apex is that they reportedly got some higher grade zones, like zones that range up to 1%, which for the US is very, very high. And it's really high anywhere outside of Saskatchewan. This is the Athabasca Basin in Canada. But when you look at the value per ton of rock like that, it starts to get into some of the most valuable ore that we'd be mining for anything anywhere on Earth. So that was intriguing. And the geology of Apex is unique in that it's associated, most of the US deposits are in these sandstones, and they're relatively, small and compact. Apex, the uranium is associated with a granite sediment contact. So without getting too much into the weeds on geology, it's a big linear geologic feature that stretches for kilometers, and there's uranium showings historically that have been reported all the way along that contact going out at least 3 kilometers away from the mine. So we're really excited about that opportunity too. If you can get a potential, if we can demonstrate and prove the potential for a kilometer scale extension of, away from the mine, then you start getting into a size that's really significant.
Yeah, and that could be very interesting. It could be interesting from the standpoint where we're producing uranium that we need here in the States and, for North America. That we're doing it in Nevada, which is not known as a huge uranium state. I mean, it's a gold silver state for sure.
A mining state. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's a mining state that we could produce it from there. But also we actually get some sort of uranium production from a mine in the United States would be so big for uranium industry. I think, David, in terms of optics, I mean, we need the optics to get better for people to stand behind this. So do you guys plan on taking this mine to the point of actually mining it, or do you think it's going to be bought out by somebody as you guys develop it?
Well, I mean, you always sort of have to see where the market is at, and certainly we know of large uranium companies that are looking very closely at I mean, a lot of people are interested in the U.S. as a market because of all the support that's developing. I mean, we've got all these measures moving through, like the potential ban on Russian uranium imports that's going through the Senate now. So if that happens, Russia supplies about 15 million pounds a year of uranium. If the ban happens, and Russia has also threatened to cut off those exports, if that happens and we lose that 15 million pounds a year, the situation gets dire pretty fast. And we could see, and we've seen in the past actually, where U.S. uranium prices actually go higher than the world price. So you get a premium price in the U.S. So because of that, we know there's a lot of people who are interested in the market. If you look in the last uranium cycle, there was a huge amount of consolidation. There was a lot of development stage companies that got bought out for hundreds of millions or billions of dollars as that cycle progressed. So, I mean, we're just, moving the project forward and gathering as much information as we can. Basically, our goal is to show that Apex can be a leading supplier of uranium and sort of fill a lot of the gaps that we need for U.S. supply. And I think if we can do that, we'll have a good avenue. There'll be a supportive environment both to build a new mine or potentially for somebody bigger to come in and take the project and develop it from there.
So you mentioned earlier somebody that you brought on as your lead technical advisor, Garrett Akinsworth. Speak a little bit about his experience. I know he worked for NextGen for a while. He's got a lot of experience in finding uranium, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Garrett has been awarded for 2 uranium discoveries, 2 separate uranium discoveries, and he was the former VP Exploration for NextGen, like you mentioned, which is a $3 billion uranium company in Canada now. So yeah, I mean, he's amongst the premier uranium geologists in the industry. I mean, a wealth of knowledge. Yeah, like I say, that knowledge is so important too, because there's so much that's advanced in uranium exploration. There's a lot of theory, a lot of testing that's gone on over the decades, new theories that evolve, new techniques that have evolved for exploration, things like airborne radiometrics. So one of the things we're really excited about is, just simply flying a plane with an instrument over it that measures radioactivity and checking which zones light up. It's actually, it's fortuitous with uranium that it actually talks to you in a way where you see the zones sticking out on surface that have the higher grades. So that's, using techniques like that are something, modern techniques, that's something we're really excited about. And that's something Garrett's absolutely critical in, because he's been applying all of these techniques on the forefront of the industry and using them to make discoveries, proven track record.
Yeah. It's great when you can use technology. Being a former tech guy, I'd love to see tech being used in mining. I think it gives you such great advantages. The last question I have for you, specific to the Apex mine. This was past producing, but it's been a while. Are there facilities nearby to help you process this stuff after you dig it out? I mean, are you going to partner with somebody to do that?
So this is one of the challenges in bringing on new U.S. uranium supply. There is currently only one operating hard rock uranium mill in the U.S. Fortunately for us, it's not too far away. It's just down the road on Highway 50 into Utah, at Blanding, Utah. That's the White Mesa mill. So, this project is well positioned in terms of being close to potential processing infrastructure. There's also a couple of other mills. Most of the mills are centered in and around Utah. So we're not too far from kind of the heartland of U.S. Uranium processing. So that's that's certainly something we'll be looking at as the project advances.
So for people that may be interested in investing in IVOR, I know a lot of people on our channel are interested in uranium. I actually have some of my employees investing in uranium as well. How do they go about finding you guys on the markets? I know you're in the Canadian Stock Exchange and you're here in the US. Can you give out your tickers?
Yeah, so we're IVOR, IVOR, on the Canadian Exchange on the CSE. And we have a new listing in the US where US investors can buy directly. So that's IVORF as in Frank.
Gotcha. And that's on the OTC markets, I believe.
That's right.
And you were saying, I think before the call, that you've gotten a lot of action in your OTC market, even maybe more so than what you saw in Canada.
That's right. We traded more volume yesterday in the US than we did in Canada, which is very rare in my experience. And I think speaks to how excited people are about, US uranium, US investors are.
Well, I think in Texas, we learned the hard way when it froze last year. It's a 50-year event for us. We don't freeze that often. But the whole state froze and everything shut down and there was no electricity. I think people figured out real quick, we need to worry about energy security. And I think that's been amplified this year with all of the uncertainty going on in Eastern Europe and what's going on there.
Yeah.
And I'm super excited for it. I think uranium is in a major bull market. We've heard people throw out prices of a couple $100. I don't think that before it's all said and done is unrealistic given supply demand characteristics. Certainly would bode well for any of the miners that, that have it. So I'm definitely interested in the sector, something we'll be following. We have been following for 4 or 5 months, and we'll continue to have you on the program, David, to bring us up to date on news as you guys have it. I know that you guys will be having some.
Terrific. Yeah, lots more to tell you.
Yeah. Last thoughts. I know you guys are doing a lot of work. Give sort of the elevator, 2-minute elevator pitch for what you guys will be doing in the next couple of months that investors should be looking out for.
So we're permitting drilling, which will be the first drilling in close to 50 years on the project. And we're also looking at, the exploration techniques I'd mentioned on the wider area. So we're excited about the potential for the mine itself. We're really excited about the potential for new discoveries, completely new discoveries in the area. So things like an airborne radiometric survey, and prospecting, basically just people, walking around on the ground looking for new discoveries. I think that's going to yield a lot of fruit.
Awesome, David. Thank you so much for being on the program. This is David Forrest from IVOR Exploration. It's got a uranium mine out there in Nevada, formerly called Apex Mine. It looks like it'd be a good one. We'll stay connected to this one and bring you guys updates from time to time. Thank you so much, David.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Appreciate it.